My view on this has always been, look, I am absolutely proud to fly the Union Jack as much as I'm proud to fly the Saltire. You look at any other Liberal politician across the globe. I mean, you see Justin Trudeau, he's happy to stand in front of the Canadian flag. You see Emmanuel Macron, who's immensely proud to be French and flies the French flag. When this person from the Lib Dems was talking about, I have no interest in the Union flag, the problem is if Liberals and people who believe in liberal values cede flags and national identity, then ultimately it always gets picked up by nationalist elements who then use that as you said, as a prop to further their agenda.
Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. My name is John Potter and today we're talking about nationalism. How do we fight it? How do we beat it? And are the things we can learn from it? So we've got voices from across the UK. First up, going up to Glasgow is David. Hello, David. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, John. My name's David McKensie. I'm actually going to be standing for the Scottish Parliament in the Glasgow Kelvin constituency. I'm actually, in relative terms, a fairly new Liberal Democrat member. I joined the party in 2019 after probably about over a decade in the Labour Party. So hoping I can offer some perspectives on nationalism in Scotland.
And I do have to ask, because your Twitter handle is @David X McKenzie. Now, is the X a really fancy middle name, or is that to do with voting and you thought, I've got to get a ballot cross mark somewhere?
No, well, so the real story behind that, okay, was when I don't have a middle name. My name is just David McKenzie, but that Twitter handle was not available. And when I was really younger, and this is terrible, I really wanted my middle name to be Xander when I was a little boy. So when I was trying to come up with what my Twitter handle would be, I just thought I'll shove the X in there.
There we go. Well, I had to know. It was really bothering me. So I'm glad we've got that cleared up right at the start. And then our next guest is all the way from Ceredigion, and we've got Cadan. Hi, Cadan.
Hi, yes, I'm Cadan at Tomos. So I'm standing in the Senedd elections that are due to be this May. Who knows when they actually will be for my home county of Ceredigion. I'm very pleased to be able to do that. I've been a Lib Dem since I was about 17, which is longer ago than I'd like to admit. And I've done all sorts of stuff in the party, from having chaired the Welsh Lib Dems national executive and worked for the party in various guises, but now finally fighting my own constituency, which is very exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. Welcome on board. And last but by no means least, we have Rosemary Bruce, who is, I believe, you are the top list candidate for the North East Scotland. Is that correct, Rosemary?
I am, yes. So we've obviously you get 2 votes for the Scottish parliamentary elections. You get 1 for your constituency, and I am the candidate for Angus North and Mearns, and I am top of the regional list for the northeast of Scotland, which covers from Dundee right up to the northeast coast. So plenty of variety within that. And
you're also a councillor, I understand, as well.
I'm a councillor, yes. I'm Councillor Aberdeenshire Council. I'm deputy group leader of the Lib Dem group, and I have been a party member since I was 16, which is, probably more than 30 years ago, definitely more than 30 years ago. So yeah, a few years of experience of campaigning and standing in elections and winning occasionally. So,
well, thank you all for coming on. And I really appreciate it, because it is interesting. The whole idea of nationalism now, I mean, a lot of people took it for granted. I remember in Lancashire, when the BNP suddenly rose out of nowhere to nearly become the main opposition in Burnley, there was shock and dismay at it. But we've seen over recent years a gradual increase in nationalism across all of the UK. Now, I suppose I'll go to you first, David. What's your experience of dealing with that? How do you deal with it? How have you fought it? I mean, what has been your experience of nationalism and the growth?
Yeah, sure. So I think I've got quite an interesting perspective on this, because in 2014 I was a Better Together organiser in Inverclyde, which is where I'm originally from, Greenock. And as I said, I was previously in the Labour Party, so was campaigning a lot on this with Labour, but also with the local Lib Dems and the Conservatives as well. And then subsequently, due to my work, I had to move to England, and during the EU referendum, I did a lot of campaigning down here, and there was a lot of nationalism involved in that as well, and especially in the Midlands, which is where my partner's from. That gave me a really different perspective than what I was hearing on the doors in London, for instance, when I was campaigning there. But I think there's there's a duality here in how people view nationalism in the UK. In Scotland, there's this promotion that it's a civic nationalism, that it's purely based on institutions and the powers and levers of government, and it's not based around identity and people or place, or that one nation's better than another. But we do see there is an undercurrent there, which is I would say the more vociferous elements of the SNP and their supporters who are taking that to a different level. I don't think that's generally the normal voter on the door that believes these things. But in England as well, I would even say, the people who voted in the 2016 referendum, who voted to leave, the majority of people I spoke to, they weren't the sort of UKIP, saying un-PC and timed racist things on the door. They were people that had real concerns, and they were asking, what's going to happen with my community, and what's going to happen to England or the United Kingdom or Scotland, and what's the future for the country, and what's the vision? And I think the point is that we probably in fighting nationalism need to take a broader vision, and what we sell to people as to what our vision for the United Kingdom, for Scotland, for England, for all the devolved nations looks like, or else we just concede that argument of people, place and community to nationalists.
Rosemary, do you agree with that? Is that kind of your experience as well?
I think so, and you're saying that nationalism rising across the UK, in many ways it's been rising across the world, and in certain countries that is taking a step back now. And I suppose I always find nationalism dangerous, because it is putting that before anything else. It is putting it forward as an idea that this is the solution to all of your problems. So whether that was Brexit, whether that's Scottish nationalism, Welsh nationalism, wherever it happens to be, that by somehow changing the setup, that this is the solution to all problems, as opposed to looking at breaking down those barriers, borders, walls, whatever that happens to be in the way, and looking to work together to sort out the problems, which are universal. And obviously it will vary from area to area as to what is the biggest issue that people want to see resolved, whether that's the economy, it's education, but it's trying to change that mindset. No, we need to work together to sort these problems. And from speaking to people just on phone canvassing, as we've only been able to do recently, people do want that. They do want to park constitutional issues, and it's therefore trying to get that focus on the day-to-day, the bread and butter, that I think is where we're going to gain ground.
And Cadan, we've had several Welsh guests on the show. Both have talked about, weird enough, getting Wales being pulled in two directions. You have some people who obviously want more Welsh nationalism, but also some people who also want to abolish Welsh nationalism in terms of kind of particularly want to remove the Senedd and all that as well. So it must be very difficult being stuck in the middle as a liberal, trying to say, actually, you're both wrong and here's why.
Yes, absolutely. It is. And it's a lot of the arguments that, as David and Rosemary mentioned, around trying to define it as a civic nationalism and everything that comes with that, I think is true in what we see of nationalism in Wales. But I think you're absolutely right in saying that the sort of the other end of the extreme isn't sort of wanting to just sort of keep the status quo. It is actually an abolishing of that Welsh Parliament that a lot of people fought over many years to put in place. And I think we're quite lucky in many senses that we haven't gone as far down the path as Scotland has in terms of entrenching those divisions. And there's still quite a lot of people sort of in the middle, as it were, between the sort of the extremes of full independence and a full abolition of the Senedd. And I think that there's an opportunity for us there to avoid that entrenchment, for us to make sure that we are making the case for that federalist option that the Liberal Democrats have always believed in. But it is difficult, and I think it is very, very dangerous, a more dangerous situation perhaps than Scotland is in, because as you say, the one extreme of that wins, then we end up with an independent Wales. But if the other extreme ends up winning, it's not just a sort of keeping the status quo, it's the completely abolishing the democracy that we have in Wales as we know
it. Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Praetor Reigns. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Praetorians have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Praetorians are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Praetorians website at praetorians.co.uk/liberal-democrats. This podcast has been sponsored by the Katora Coffee Club, the UK's most environmentally friendly coffee club. There are over 400 independent roasters in the UK, each one crafting coffee in their own unique style. Katora Coffee Club works with some of the best to take you on a voyage of coffee discovery. The Katora Coffee Club delivers ethically sourced and independently roast coffee directly to your door. Each month you'll receive between 2 and 4 bags of coffee and their monthly extract magazine. Even better for Lib Dem Podcast listeners, use the code BETTERCOFFEE to save 5% on subscriptions and gift boxes for a limited time only. All Katora Coffee Club boxes are carbon negative and offset the CO2. So why not do some good, enjoy some great coffee and check out the website www.katoracoffeeclub.com. Now, back to the podcast. And I, for those who don't know, I grew up in a tiny little rural area in Cumbria where even though there was virtually no ethnic minorities there was still the BNP used to go in there and things like that. I think maybe they got confused that Whitehaven was more than just a place name. But it was an interesting experience because nationalism tends to feed off other issues rather than actually do. So are people in Scotland, for example, wanting to go to the SNP, not because they genuinely believe that the Scotland will be better outside of the UK, but because they're frustrated with being the after rounds of the UK Parliament?
I think there's certainly an element of that, and certainly the SNP and the Conservatives have wanted to portray the fight as between the two of them throughout the years, because the Liberal Democrats and Labour, in some people's minds, are just getting in the way of that, and it's been called the Ulsterisation of Scottish politics, is to go into the extremes. But what you've seen in Northern Ireland is that people have gone to those extremes, found that they couldn't make agreement on a variety of day-to-day issues that people needed to have resolution on, and things have started to move away from that. So yeah, there's an element of that, but it is absolutely getting to the bread and butter day-to-day issues that's going to win us over.
And David, do we think liberalism is strong enough to beat it? Because obviously, I always have the opinion that it's very easy to sell division. Your life's rubbish, blame them. Well, actually, liberalism is a lot more nuanced in terms of actually there's X, Y, and Z reason why you might be unhappy. How hard is that fight going to be going forward?
I think it's probably not as difficult as we tend to think it is. I think when you speak to a lot of regular voters, actually, they're not that entrenched in what they're looking at. As they're looking at, okay, what the situation that I'm in currently, what is your vision as a party, and how are you going to get me out of that? Now, ultimately, if you're looking at Scotland, the SNP's solution to everything is independence. And how they hark it is that independence will absolutely solve all of the issues that you or your family or your friends may have, experienced in their lives or are experiencing currently. But they fail to fundamentally answer the basic questions of how independence will solve poverty, how it will solve currency issues, how it will make the economy better, how it will help people get homes, how it will get people get jobs, how all these things. And really what liberalism, I think, needs to do is it needs to be stronger in putting forth the arguments about how, okay, we are absolutely, sure that the United Kingdom is not perfect. That's why we as a party want to see a federal UK. We want to reform the UK as it is. But the best opportunity you, your friends, your family have is remaining part of that United Kingdom, being part of that trading community. And ultimately, we are an internationalist party. So the thing that always very much confuses me about the SNP is they say we're more than happy to take a national view, cut us off because we want to be an independent nation and make our own decisions and get away from England. But then we want to go and join Europe and have somebody else come in and make those decisions that we've just said we want to get away from Westminster as a result to do. You can't have that level of duality. And I think what the Lib Dems in Scotland especially need to be doing is really pointing out that this stance doesn't really make very much sense. And we totally believe in being part of the United Kingdom. We are a European party, an internationalist party. I don't see how this solves any of the issues that people are experiencing currently.
And I wonder, Cadan, do you think we have to fight smarter as well? That sometimes we pick fights that people either don't care about or are so niche that it's not the main issue for, or even that we give attention to things that don't need any extra attention to the point where it throws us off our game, and we don't concentrate on actually the virtues of liberalism and progressive politics.
I think so, and I think in Wales in particular, like a lot of the discussion over the last 20 years of devolution has been very process driven, very sort of stuck in the mud about should we devolve X and Y but not Z, and what should we have those powers but in this particular way. And I think that has contributed to I think a lack of the Senedd as it is now taking hold among the Welsh population as the Scottish Parliament has done, because I think because of the way that the powers and the relationship between the Senedd and the people has developed over time, I think it's not really had that opportunity to embed itself. But I think, I do think that we need to be thinking about things in a smarter way and thinking about the way that we communicate things, because like I always approach this having sort of grown up in an area and sort of from a background where you'd expect me with my name, with the school that I went to, you'd expect me to be from a background of wanting to seek an independent Wales. And actually, that a lot of that has actually coloured my thinking about and did lead me towards the Liberal Democrats and our belief in federalism, because in reality, we're not actually approaching things from that different a standpoint. We both recognise that there are issues with the United Kingdom as it is, that does in some cases hamper our ability in Wales to govern ourselves and use the powers that we've got. We just have different answers about how to control that and how to address that. And as liberals, we don't believe in erecting borders, whether they however invisible they might be. A border is a border, and we believe in breaking them down. We believe in working together, and I think having a bit more of that approach in the way that we talk and talk about nationalism and combating nationalism, I think particularly in Wales, I think would do us in good stead. I'm not sure, having not really operated much in Scotland, I don't know whether that will work. I suspect because everything is a bit more entrenched, it might not. But I think given where we are in Wales and the fact that we're still a few steps further behind, as it were, in that path towards where Scotland has gone, I really think that there is still that moment for reconciliation and for us to not divide ourselves in the way that Scotland seems to have
done. And that division in Scotland, obviously, we go back to David, you were talking about 2014 and the SNP surge that happened afterwards, because it was seen that all three of the Westminster parties are on one side and the SNP are on the side of everybody else. Now, there is an issue, Rosemary, about the party is very London-centric. A lot of our power base is London-centric. I mean, Scotland actually, other than 100 votes and Joe Swinson losing the seat, was actually looking like it was going to be a fairly decent night, making a game again against the SNP, etc. But because the party is London-centric, and it tends to be seen from a London sort of prism. You could disagree. Maybe you think it isn't London-centric, but you're absolutely perfectly welcome to disagree with me. But I do feel like sometimes our arguments in national, and I am English. Obviously, I grew up near the Scottish border, but not on it. That certain English Lib Dems look at the SNP and go, "Oh, aren't they nice? Aren't they lovely? They're saying all the stuff that we want to say."
Well, can I make one?
Go on.
Sorry, Rosemary. I was just going to make one very quick point there, John, which was you talked about, the Lib Dems are seen as being very London-centric. Well, a lot of people in Scotland actually view the SNP as being very Edinburgh-centric, and there's really no difference for people in local communities as how far Edinburgh is, for instance, from Greenock, where I'm from, to how London is far. They see them as still disconnected from the community and the problems that they have there. So I think it maybe sometimes from an English Lib Dem perspective, they don't see it in that sort of that scenario. They think, oh, they're supporting Scotland, whereas actually, you look at, for instance, the Shetland Islands, they're saying if Scotland goes independent, we want to become a crown dependency because this is, Edinburgh's as far away a government as London is.
I completely agree with what David's just said, and I speak as someone who's was born and brought up in London and has moved to the northeast quite some time ago now, but and I think federalism, we've had so many discussions within the party. How do you explain federalism to the person on the street when you knock on someone's door? Because it is complicated in terms of where you're starting from and where you live. But I think, well, it's two things. One, there certainly needs to be far more devolved power within Scotland. And speaking as someone who is a councillor, the power does seem to be completely retained within the centre, within Edinburgh, as David was saying, and it's not being dispersed, certainly with the financial controls to local levels where we can make decisions. But in terms of the wider view of how the SNP is interpreted and seen in other parts of the country, I know people who will read the same paper, but the London edition or the England edition as opposed to the Scottish edition, and the SNP is portrayed in completely different light, and everything's sweetness and light and everything's working so well in Scotland, and it's not. And it's only when you can get some interviewers, whether it's Andrew Marr, it's Andrew Neil, who really grill down to the SNP leadership and say, but you haven't achieved this, and these standards are slipped and you're way behind on that hopefully people will get a far more rounded view of reality, and it's not all sweetness and light. And I know that some people, short-termism, obviously lots of people vote for lots of different reasons, but short-term reasons are often top of people's things. I need to solve this now, and they will see the Westminster government, the UK government, and they'll look at Boris, they'll look at Michael Gove and so on. They go, we've got to get rid of them. The quickest, easiest way of doing that is independence. And that will be the solution that some people will grasp on without fully looking at the reasons behind or the implications of doing that.
And has coronavirus in the last year kind of allowed the mask to slip a little bit from the SNP? I mean, certainly I think there was one where there was an English-born photographer going up to the Highlands who was basically told he wasn't welcome. Is that now coming through in Scotland? Because again, we don't hear about it in the rest of the party. Is there now kind of think that, well, the SNP have got past their peak and now actually, I mean, we're hearing all sorts of the arguments about Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon and the court cases and everything else, but is public perception starting to think, ooh, maybe the SNP aren't quite as cuddly as what we thought?
There's always been an element of that behind the scenes, and certainly if you look at Twitter feeds and so on, you can see that. But the leadership has always been keen to downplay that, and when no racism, it's civic nationalism and so on. But there's always been an element of that. But by definition, that the more that people are in power, those sort of cracks can appear, and I definitely think you are seeing that.
Yeah, there's definitely there's. In 2014, I was called everything from a traitor to a quisling. And for any of the listeners who don't understand what a quisling is, it was the people who collaborated with the Nazis when I was looking to get the country to vote no. And there is an extreme element within the SNP who are vociferously nationalist. And I noticed there's been a real effort by the SNP to get themselves away from the tagline of nationalist. Even though, Nicola Sturgeon not that long ago was happy to declare herself as my fellow nationalists at their party conference. I think they're trying to distance themselves from that. My partner's English. She actually got, during the 2014 referendum, some very nasty things said to her as being an English person living in Scotland. And there's, to give you an example, I went out campaigning one day during the 2014 referendum with a saltire in hand, and I was told by a local SNP activist, "Why have you got that flag? It doesn't belong to you." And I said, this flag doesn't belong to you either, mate. It belongs to everybody that lives here and chooses to be a part of this, whether Scottish or not. So there is an element there. I think they're trying to distance themselves from it. But in terms of where the coronavirus epidemic has really shown some cracks for the SNP, like there's Nicola Sturgeon's a fantastic communicator, and I don't think there's any denying that. And she's done extremely well when she's been asked to give her press conferences on BBC Scotland. But when you actually look at the decisions and the things that were put in place and the decisions that were made about how you tackle this pandemic, they didn't do anything different than the UK government beyond maybe a couple of little things. But, you know, we did some national phone banking at the weekend, and a lot of people were telling me they were very, very annoyed with how this pandemic's been approached and how it's been, how, for instance, having no lockdown up until late on in Christmas would have maybe saved us having to go straight back into another lockdown and opening things up. So I think there are people that are starting to look at how were these decisions made and why have we decided to do that? And really, have they done anything different than the UK government that we all apparently don't like?
And you've actually perfectly segued, David, by mentioning about flags, because last week and into the weekend, there was some disagreement amongst Lib Dems on Twitter. And I get Twitter's not the real world, but we'll take it for what it is right now. There was quite a few comments about how a lot of the Tory ministers have got the Union flag behind them. Keir Starmer then did his address with the Union flag behind him. Now, for me, I'm reading a book currently called Beyond the Red Wall, which explains why Labour lost so badly in the Northern and Midland seats. And one of the points made for it was obviously the disaster of Corbyn. And Corbyn was a disaster for all sorts of reasons. But one of them was he wasn't felt to like this country. And he would either like not sing the national anthem, and it all kind of chipped away at this vision of Corbyn as not being particularly proud of being British. Now, and I as soon as I read that, I thought, how easy would it be for just to have a flag in the background? Because you see it in American politics, you see it in European politics, you see it in. I put a photo on the podcast feed showing people like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, not right-wing nationalists, but other countries use the flag as a way of saying, look, I'm proud of this country. And what that Beyond the Red Wall said is these voters, okay, some of them I had vastly different opinions on to what they were talking about, whether it was immigration, but they were proud of where they lived. And part of that identity was the Union flag. Now, Cadan, in Wales, do you think Lib Dems should be using the Union flag more? Otherwise, do we surrender it to nationalists, or it won't be the nationalists in Wales, are we afraid of being proud to be British and believe in a federal Britain?
I think it depends on your perspective, really. So, like, I'm someone who's never had a particularly warm feeling towards the Union flag. I suspect that probably has a lot to do with the background I come from. Probably also a lot to do with the fact that symbolically Wales isn't represented on that flag, because historically Wales was annexed by the Kingdom of England as it was then, and so just sort of that is through how we are represented on the flag through being part of what was the Kingdom of England geographically. So I think that does sort of stem from that a little bit, but I do use it. On my Twitter bio, I've got I have the Welsh flag, I've got the European flag. European Union flag, I've got the Union Jack, and I've got the rainbow flag as signifiers of my identity. And I think it is important for to not sort of seed symbols like that as being only belonging to a certain group, as David was saying earlier about sort of his interactions with of waving the saltire. I think that they are symbols for all of us, and I think part of the problem of perhaps from my perspective here in Wales of not necessarily seeing or having much of a warm feeling towards that flag, it probably is a signifier for something, the problem that leads to nationalism and leads to greater calls for independence. And I think in order to fix that sort of symbolism and fix that sense of ownership, you need to fix the problems that are underlying it.
And Rosemary, do you think, what's your views on this really? Do you think because there is a thing is, this is, the Union flag is everyone's flag, and we shouldn't, and it does represent, taking what Cadan's just said there about the whole of the Union, and we are better as a Union than we are split apart, and what we can do as a Union. And I completely get, there was a Scottish Lib Dem who commented when I said we were going to have this discussion, who said she has no interest in the Union flag whatsoever, and that she is just of an opinion that even when it comes to sports or anything like that, she doesn't really mind if a British, say in the Olympics, if a British player is playing against someone from another country, that isn't part of her equation, which is fair enough. But I would suggest that is probably a very, very kind of minority view in terms, I think most people, whether it's sport or anything else, generally like to be associated with the flag. Or am I misreading this?
I think it depends on the situation. I mean, there is a very fine line, as you've said, between patriotism and nationalism. And as David touched on earlier, it's when people say it's mine and it's mine alone for a particular reason, or it's a political party or whatever. So if I'm at a rugby match, quite happy to see Saltire's, the flag of St George, whatever it happens to be, because that's the team. Equally happy to have Union flags if it's the Olympics when we come together as a team for that. And I think there does have to be an element of reclaiming flags where people have said, no, it's mine, in terms of the SNP saying you can't use the Saltire because it belongs only to nationalists. And so I think we have included small elements of flags when it comes to leaflets and so on, whether that's the Saltire and the Union Jack and the European flag as well, of course. So I think it's using them in the right context, and absolutely see that the people around the world will have them there as a patriotic statement when the Prime Minister or President, whoever it happens to be, is giving some media coverage. But it's to make sure that they're not misused, or that they become almost the foreground as opposed to something that's just in the background, that's always there as part of an office or a press conference of some description. So people will always have their own different perspectives on it. I find flags fascinating in terms of the history behind them all and how they come together and how they've changed over the years in certain circumstances. But it's a very measured use and not a flag waving at every opportunity.
But I think one of the things I'd like to get is, so you were talking about people misrepresenting it. And a classic case is Donald Trump. Let's look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the most self-serving idiot probably the world has seen in ages. And he would go around and he'd hug the American flag and he would kiss it and stuff like that. But it was he was doing that as a prop rather than, it didn't mean anything to him. So what is the best way, David? I want to ask you, what is the best ways of liberals or progressives countering that? I would say the worst possible way of doing it is the way Emily Thornberry did when she saw pictures of a house emblazoned with St George's flags and said, "This is Rochester," or whatever she said at the time, and it was a very sneering look at it. But how should we respond to that?
Yeah, so look, and I, funnily enough, I actually once had a chat with Emily Thornberry about that particular tweet, but that's another thing entirely. So in terms of my view on this has always been, look, I am absolutely proud to fly the Union Jack as much as I'm proud to fly the Saltire. You look at any other liberal politician across the globe. I mean, you see Justin Trudeau, he's happy to stand in front of the Canadian flag. You see Emmanuel Macron, who's immensely proud to be French and flies the French flag. When this person from the Lib Dems was talking about, I have no interest in the Union flag, the problem is if liberals and people who believe in liberal values cede flags and national identity, then ultimately it always gets picked up by nationalist elements who then use that as you said, as a prop to further their agenda. If you look at, there was a concerted effort in the 90s to take the Union Jack away from being associated with racist right-wing elements of things like the National Front and the BNP, and people became very proud of it. And that was, the Britpop, the sort of cool Britannia culture that came up as a result. You see in America, when you talked about Donald Trump kissing the flag, though, if you actually notice, for a long period of time, the people who were associated with being, racist and right-wing, they fell to the Confederate flag because that was the only option that became available to them to promote their ideals and their values. Yeah, well, yeah, and you probably saw how many were being flown when they raided the Capitol, etc. Look, there's when I was in the Labour Party, I actually did a very interesting talk with John Denham, who used to be the Labour MP, and he talks a lot about especially English identity and this sort of fear of tackling English identity and patriotism in politics. And he said, ultimately, if you don't promote that liberal values are completely compatible with these ideas of patriotism and being proud of the place, the community, the nation that you come from, then you give all those symbols away to people who will ultimately misuse them to tell you things that you think you want to hear about how they're going to promote Englishness, how they're going to promote Britishness, how they're going to promote being Scottish. We have to take them and we need to embrace them, and we need to be proud to use things like the Union Jack. And we are a patriotic party as well as being a liberal party, and that's not a nationalist view. That's just about, ultimately, if we as a party were going to get in and represent the nation as the controlling power, we will always have Britain's best interests at heart first of all, but we are still internationalists, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's actually in France, and I did once have a small talk on this, the idea of Gaullism, which is from Charles de Gaulle, which was the view that the French nation is proud of their nation because they view the Republic as almost a person, as opposed to sort of national identity. And it's that pride in the Republic that drives their sort of patriotism and their ideals of being French. That's totally from, although Gaulle was centre-right, the centrists within France, like Macron, have totally captured that, because they know if they're going to win elections, then they need to be seen as being proud to be French and promoting, they call it espace mondial, and that's my best French accent, which is promoting French culture and French views of how the world should work globally. And they do that, and they do it from a liberal perspective. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being patriotic and being proud to fly the Union Jack at all.
I think absolutely, and just wanted to touch on something you said about identity, and obviously, a flag is very much a symbol of identity, and I think what I was trying to get at before, and what I think a lot of people who have reluctance in sort of signifying themselves with the Union Jack would say is that, particularly in places like Scotland and Wales, is that they don't necessarily identify with it because there's a sense that the Union Jack is sort of the default of what actually is England, and I think it's a lack of perhaps a proud English identity in many senses that leads to sort of the co-option of British flag, the British symbols, as being English. And I think until we, I think England very much needs to foster itself as its own identity, and if we are successful in trying to get a federal UK, I think those regions and subsections of England need to foster those identities too. But I think in order for the Union Jack to be more inclusive of people in Wales and Scotland, and I imagine Northern Ireland as well, who don't really identify with it, I think there needs to be a strong English identity that sort of counteracts the strong Welsh identity and the strong Scottish identity that many of us feel, so that the British flag and the British symbols that come with it can feel more like it belongs to everyone. I think a lot of the growth and the resentment that comes from that leads to nationalist and independence supporting tendencies comes from that feeling that they don't feel represented in it, because it does, in many cases, in far too many cases, it defaults to England, for Britain see England in so many cases. So I think that's the sort of thing that needs to be counteracted if we are going to, create a union which is inclusive and sort of hopefully win back some of the people who have turned to independence and supporting independence as what they see as an only option.
And it'd be really interesting. I mean, we haven't yet done an episode about the regionalisation of England, because don't forget, if you go somewhere like Cornwall, a lot of people find themselves Cornish before English.
Yep.
I was at university in York, and I was surprised to see quite how much of a Yorkshire identity is actually.
Yeah, but that's just Yorkshire people. Come on, I live in Lancashire. You know, that superiority of Yorkshire people is just. It wouldn't matter. There's Yorkshire, and then there's the rest of the universe. Really, is how that works.
There's the better coloured rose, though. I think that's the issue.
Oh, well, yeah, okay. So we've talked about some of the. So how do we fight it? How do we fight it? And are there things we can learn from nationalists in the strategies they use? Obviously, we abhor the message, but is there ways we can learn from what nationalists do in the way they campaign, the way they take maybe a single issue and really push it, that we need to do in this fight? And Rosemary, maybe I should come to you first. So how do you fight? I mean, you're based up in Aberdeen, so how is it on a council level when you're going forward? How do you fight it? What is your best technique?
I think a lot of it is to find all the things where you agree, and there are quite a lot of circumstances where we agree on policy levels. If you park the nationalism part of it in terms of social justice and so on, but I think what we've got to get across to people in these elections is that if you say I'm going to vote SNP because I'm patriotic, and that might be your reason, the patriotic thing is to remain within the United Kingdom, because that's the best way of getting what we want for Scotland, and how the SNP have let people down. Our education standards have fallen within schools on a variety of different levels. Our healthcare service is under pressure, and the SNP have not done the best that they could do for Scotland, because they've been so focused on independence and nationalism in their view, that they haven't been focused entirely on what they should have been doing in terms of the day-to-day lives of everybody there. So I think it's to say that we would focus on these things. This would be the best thing for you within Scotland, but to have Scotland within the United Kingdom.
What about you, Cadan? How do you think you've got a big election coming up? Obviously, Ceredigion used to have Mark Williams as its MP. This is an area that had a proud Liberal history. So how are you going to take this fight forward?
Well, absolutely, yeah. We're the only Lib Dem Plaid Cymru marginal in the country, so I think it's an interesting context to be in. And we don't have the I wouldn't call it a luxury, perhaps, but the ability to point to a sort of a record of action for the Plaid Cymru government, although they do help control the local council in Ceredigion. But they've not been in government in Wales for quite a while now. So sort of pointing to sort of a record of a lack of delivery, I'd imagine, is not really an option. I think sort of in terms of tactics, one of the things that always strikes me is how blue sky and inspiring a lot of the stuff that comes out of particularly the pro-independence campaign here, but also Plaid Cymru in general. They want to inspire people, and they come at it from a place of capturing hearts rather than trying to convince minds. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. Pushing charismatic people to the fore, making sure that we're using those emotional arguments as well as the very detailed, factual, policy-based arguments that we're all used to at a Lib Dem conference. But I think talking to people's hearts and understanding where they're coming from, what makes them tick, and making sure that we're talking to their needs is really, really important. I remember someone in one of the many discussions, almost arguments I have on Twitter with generally with people who are independent supporters. But I remember someone telling me federalism's never going to work because no one's ever going to march for federalism. And I mean, not only ideas that have people marching for them deserve merit or to be actually considered to as government policy, but I think there is an element of truth in us needing to inspire people. Anything that gets loads of people out on the streets wanting to shout and make their voice heard is clearly an idea that's going to have some traction. So I think if we can talk about things in a way that get people fired up and get people wanting to support us because we really care about this issue that they also care about, and we talk about it in an inspiring way, I think that's clearly going to lead to results. So I think that the challenge is on us to talk about and find ways of expressing our liberalism in a way that gets people fired up in that way.
And David, I'm going to get you to finish off this point. I mean, I love that line, capturing hearts instead of convincing minds. I mean, that's brilliant. But I want to be devil's advocate here in the sense that what we've seen in Britain in terms of general elections is the less radical you are, the more likely you are to win. So, do you agree with that, or do you think how would you then take forward to change things? It's difficult. I mean, there was the idea was we're going to be radical moderates or whatever that phrase was. I can't remember. It came up like a year or so ago, and it's not something that is a particular big rallying cry. So, taking what Cadan's just said, how would you expand on that?
Look, I think the language probably needs to change a bit. Look, the way that nationalists gain support is because they have this all-encompassing broad vision of what we're going to deliver for you as a person, as a voter, as a country, as a nation. And we tend to kind of shy away from that language a little bit. And we tend to say, I think in the last election, although we did have this sort of big policy of, we're going to stop Brexit, which was quite seen as very radical as opposed to maybe moderate. But we tend to shy away from the idea of like a big, bold vision for the country and what we want to actually achieve and what we want to do in government. And people want to know where you're going to lead the country and ultimately what you're going to deliver. And I think we need to, we've been, as a party, probably extremely pragmatic, and this is our policy proposals, and it's all based on science, and it's all based on it's been judged by economists to be the most appropriate for putting into position, and that's fantastic. And I'm not for a minute suggesting that you go throw all that out the door and just promise everything in the world to get votes, but I think there needs to be a kind of reimagining of what would a liberal Britain look like? What would a liberal Scotland look like? What would a liberal Wales look like? And for our sister party, the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland, what would a liberal Northern Ireland look like? And what will that deliver to you as a community, as a person, as a place? And how will it improve your daily life? And I think we've struggled with that in recent years, and we've struggled to promote what a liberal UK would look like. So I think there needs to be a view to that. You've had Ian Cairns on this podcast before, and Ian talks a lot about this idea of a citizen's Britain, and what does a citizen's Britain actually mean, and pulling that on what Paddy Ashdown once wrote about delivering this. And I think we really need to start thinking about what that vision looks like. And we, as Cadan said there as well, federalism is not something that people are really going to get off their butts and march for, but perhaps it's the language as well, because I think people don't really understand what federalism is. They understand what independence is, they understand what the status quo is, but they don't really understand how you could change that without having independence. And I think we probably need to come up with a good way of articulating that and how we put it across to people too.
And it's important to realize, again, the book I'm reading, what percentage of the UK population even knew any of the manifesto commitments from any party whatsoever?
It's probably extremely minimal.
Single digits.
It was 10%. That was it, 10%. And the rest of them, the vast majority of people didn't even know the manifestos had come out. So again, the language has got to be enough to get through. If you know one thing about the SNP, it's X. Now we need to know, if you know one thing about the Lib Dems, it's what?
Well, what's interesting you say there, John, as well, is because you talked about, how many people actually knew what was within the manifesto. You look at the most successful political campaigns have always been around a very quick message that people can easily understand. Conservatives last election, get Brexit done. Yeah. 2015 and I guess to an extent 2019, the SNP, stronger for Scotland. They might not mean anything in substantive terms, but they mean a lot of things to people who want to take that message on board and believe what they want it to mean. I don't think we've really had a successful tagline like that says this is what liberalism stands for and this is what our campaign's going to be grounded in.
Yeah, even when we went into the 2010 election with that massive gobbledygook two-part slogan, which no one was going to repeat, a change that works for you, building a fairer Britain, back to you on the doorstep, aren't they? But like when you compare it to yes we can, everyone has heard those three words. Everyone has heard Barack Obama saying those three words because it encapsulates so much, and it encapsulates so much of that hope and belief that people wanted to believe in at that point, and that change that they hoped that he would bring. And and that's why you have that phenomenon of the Obama Trump voter, as they call it. People who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. How on earth can you countenance that sort of thing when you think about it logically? But it's people who are looking for that sense of change, wanting to improve things, wanting things to be better, and they wrongly, obviously, but saw Trump as the means to achieve that. And that is the challenge. Is people want their lives to be better, and we've got to inspire them somehow to believe that we are the ones that are going to make it better.
And it's not an easy thing to do either. I think we shouldn't disguise it. I mean, I think I've been on all the conferences I've been to before on the run-up to general elections. They've always come with like closed doors, make sure there's no press next year when you do it. And they say, right, this is the slogan we're going to do. It's polled really well. And then, it's ended up being dud. It's a really difficult, as someone who works in marketing, it is a difficult thing. I mean, I still use demand better because I actually quite like it. I think it was a good phrase and it can be used across, but it is very difficult. But I think one thing we should all, I assume you're all going to agree on, is, whatever fights we have about nationalism, whether that was going right back to when I started, is when the Lib Dems took control of Burnley because they were scared the BNP were going to take over that town. You have to fight for it as well. Whatever messages HQ sends out, it's down to on the ground working to make sure people understand that liberalism and hard work and being there for your community are all wrapped up in one. And I take it that's a message you would all echo.
Absolutely.
Yeah, completely.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, on that, I've never had that before on a podcast that I've got everyone agree with me. So
I disagree, John.
All right, there we go. But no, I'm with that. I just want to say thank you all for being on the podcast. It's been really, really fascinating, and I'd love to. If you guys ever want to come back on, please do get in touch. I know David was right on it. David was like, "Yeah, I want to come on." It was no problem with that. But
I'll get pelters for that now. That'll be like egomaniac, just wants to be all over it.
But
it's just put it.
Yeah. And it's been a fantastic discussion because I think you were right, Rosemary. You said I think the top of populism and nationalism, I think, has gone now. I think Biden's victory was such a cleansing moment to say, actually, Trump's gone. Maybe, we're going to have successes in places like Bulgaria and Hungary and stuff like that, which have had other problems. The way forward, but change never happens without us fighting for it. And I think that's the message to all Lib Dems listening, is that, whenever these elections take place, the Scottish and Welsh elections are huge and massive. But the local elections, the county elections, the mayoralty elections, these are a huge set of elections where we can say, actually, Britain is better than what we've got at the moment. So thank you all three of you for being on. We really appreciate it. Do follow these guys on Twitter. I'll put their Twitter handles in the show notes. Do follow everything to do with the Lib Dem Podcast at Lib Dem Pod. My name is John Potter. Thank you so much for watching, whether it was on Facebook or YouTube or downloading it wherever you get your podcast from. We'll be back with another episode very soon. And in the meantime, stay safe.